This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 94 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending March 16th, 2018, the March Madness edition. This Week in FCPA is sponsored by Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring, ethics, and compliance assessments nationally and internationally across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the compliance monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 600 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at their website, www.affiliatedmonitors.com. March Madness is truly upon us as we have the first number 16 seed knocking off a number 1 seed. In the midst of this true madness, Jay Rosen and I take a look at some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories. Number 1, obviously March Madness and corruption in NCAA basketball. We take a look at comments by former FCPA unit head Chuck Duross that self-reporting is, quote, probably not worth it, end quote. We consider the SEC enforcement action against Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos for her engagement in a massive years-long fraud. We take a look at some of the compliance lessons to be learned from the Novartis anti-corruption, or perhaps we should say corruption journey, that Jacqueline Jaeger reported on in Compliance Week. We consider the first DPA granted under the new French anti-corruption law, Sapin II. SFO David Green pushes back on the myth that DPAs are sweetheart deals in a piece in the FCPA Blog. We consider whether corporate monitors will continue to exist in FCPA enforcement actions, and round out with highlights from the Trace Global Enforcement Report. I talk about the new, exciting new podcast I'm premiering on Tuesday, Innovation in Compliance. I hope you will check it out. It will be available on the FCPA Compliance Report, iTunes, Libsyn, and YouTube. My new book, The Complete Compliance Handbook, will be published in April by Compliance Week. It's available for pre-sale on my website. Jonathan Armstrong, well-known data privacy and data security practitioner, will be in Houston on April 10th to put on a half-day GDP workshop. You can register and find out more information at the Greater Houston and Business and Ethics Roundtable website. This is Tom Fox. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, back with my colleague, Jay Rosen, for another episode of This Week in FCPA. This is the March Madness edition. And, Jay, we really have some madness going on because last night, we had the first number 16 seed upset a number 1 seed as UVA went down. So madness is here, and we had some madness this week. So why don't we just jump right into it?
Yeah, and the first bit of March Madness comes from a little piece you wrote for Compliance Week. Why don't you tell us about March Madness and corruption?
So I think probably everyone in the compliance world is aware of the allegations of systemic corruption around NCAA basketball. We had a number of arrests earlier this year by the Department of Justice involving pay to play, to monies paid to high school students to direct them to certain universities. One coach was audio taped, offering up to $100,000. There have been allegations of that amount being offered by two others rather. So really systemic corruption at a level of the coaches, which we had not previously seen. Apparel makers have been dragged into this. They're apparently alleged to be the funding mechanisms. And Jay, I know you're shocked to actually hear that amateurism and college athletes would be paid, but this really takes the pay-to-play to a whole new level. The NCAA, being the spineless worms that they are, have said, well, we're going to investigate the student athletes and we'll discipline anyone who took money. Of course, what they've neglected to tell us is that this year alone, they took in over $1 billion in revenues from basketball, largely, of course, from television revenues, and that all of the teams in this year's tournament who are alleged to have players who were paid, they were magically cleared, literally within weeks of these allegations coming out. So I guess the NCAA proves once again that it truly is the clowns of college athletics. Not only can they've proven they can't investigate, they've now proven that they really have no reason to exist other than to just make money. The interesting thing, I think, is where this may go. And clearly, the NCAA actually was pushing back yesterday in advertisements on March Madness games, saying that only 2% of all student athletes made it to the pros. I suppose if you add in everybody down to the wrestling, lacrosse, and soccer or fencing teams, that's probably correct. The problem is that the colleges are making tons of money on these major sports, and they're not compensating employees, i.e. the student athletes. So I think it's probably going to presage the end of the NCAA. The NBA, I think, views this as both a problem and an opportunity. And so the professional sports may step in and create some system so that either players can be paid and or there's not this locked in ridiculous one and done or three and done in case of the NFL. But once again, the NCAA proves to be completely failing the task in front of them. These arrests were done by the FBI or by the Department of Justice based upon investigations by the FBI, and apparently the NCAA had no idea any of this was going on. So I thought it was a great way to introduce March Madness. So for those who love college basketball, this is our weekend. It's probably the best 4 days of college basketball you can ever see. So I think I still have my Final Four left as of the second day, but I'm not sure. Jay, we had some interesting comments from our colleague, or at least our friend Chuck Duross. You want to tell us about those?
Sure. We're picking up an article that we're going to link to from Global Investigations Review by Kelly Swanson. And the title is Former FCPA Unit Chiefs Say Self-Reporting is Still Probably Not Worth It. So at the Emerging Issues in FCPA Enforcement Conference at George Washington University on March 9th, two former heads of the DOJ's FCPA unit, Mark Mendelson and Chuck Duross, got together with former chief of the SEC, Cheryl Scarborough, and they discussed the benefits of self-reporting under the DOJ's corporate enforcement policy for foreign bribery cases. While they praised the DOJ for its transparency in lately releasing policies that offer self-reporting companies a declination, they also agreed that the consequence of voluntarily disclosing misconduct mostly outweighs the benefits. And this is Chuck Duross speaking, saying, I think the DOJ has tried to provide greater certainty and clarity and a list of criteria, Duross said. But boy, in doing that, they have reached the resolution where they take almost all of it, parenthetical, the incentives to self-report back, because if you are a company, what you care about is your reputation. And then he further went on to say, the reward is forevermore your name will be tattooed on the DOJ's website as having violated the FCPA and paid disgorgement. So it's a huge disincentive for companies to self-report. And in cases with aggravating circumstances, the potential benefit to self-reporting to the DOJ, as we know, is a 50% reduction off a criminal fine. However, companies that do not self-report can still qualify for 25%. So Duross said the difference between 50% and 25% is not enough to make companies view self-disclosing as favorable. He added that the main criterion that companies should look at when deciding to self-report is if they think the government could find out about their conduct anyway. So it's it's very interesting to see people who are on the other side of the table come out, and at the end of the day, over the last several years, we've seen several attempts for the DOJ to really, pull the curtain aside and show what they are considering when they're offering to give companies a reduction in their fines and trying to incentivize them to self-report. And even though this declination with a disgorgement seems to be a good resolution from a monetary point of view, you've got these three esteemed former enforcers who are saying at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you think we're going to get caught? So very interesting comments. What are your thoughts on them, Tom?
So I guess, Jay, we've heard these types of arguments before, but one thing we had not really heard, or at least put right up front by Chuck Duross, is that companies are more concerned about their reputations than the fines and penalties. And that relates to the posting of the company's name on the DOJ website that they received a declination. And I really had not thought that companies had considered reputational damage as a reason not to self-disclose. It really, that seems almost counterintuitive to me. Nevertheless, you have to respect Chuck because he's obviously not only the former head of the FCPA unit, but now in private practice represents companies who are in FCPA hot water. So I assume that, he's heard that from his clients. The difficulty or the competing considerations are myself and a wide variety of commentators have argued for years, literally, that these declinations need to be made public. All declinations need to be made public. And the declinations that came about under the FCPA pilot program and now under the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy, I think really lend themselves and lead to greater compliance because we now have more information about what the both the company thought in terms of a reason to self-report, but also obviously what the DOJ thought was important in terms of the facts, the cooperation, and the remediation. So we seem to kind of be at odds here between or by what may incentivize in companies and what may incentivize the government and what may incentivize the rest of us. So an interesting dialogue. Once again, the part about company reputation as the driving force in whether or not to self-disclose, I thought was an interesting, if not new fact, certainly brought to the attention a little bit more than we've normally seen in the past. And as we know, whenever Chuck Duross speaks, you better listen.
So, Tom, why don't you tell us about Elizabeth Holmes and how do you say her company? Is it Theranos or Theranos?
Well, I say Theranos, but I say hurricane and I say insurance. That's just the way Southerners talk. So Theranos is Theranos. And first, I'd like to note the passing of Stephen Hawking, one of the greatest scientific minds, certainly of the 20th century, and perhaps the greatest, I don't know if you consider him greater than Richard Feynman, but right up there with Richard Feynman in my eyes. So tip of the hat to Stephen Hawking, and not only the greatness of his mind, Jay, but the greatness of what he did with the horrible disability he developed in the 20s, which was Lou Gehrig's disease. And I read several articles that talked about his disability and his public, very public display of overcoming his disabilities, maybe an even greater lasting legacy. So I wanted to give that shout out to Stephen Hawking and note that. But we had a extraordinary, and I can't emphasize that word enough, extraordinary SEC complaint agreed to by Elizabeth Holmes, founder of Theranos, where she agreed to a civil penalty of $500,000, returned almost 19 million shares of stock to the company, and agreed to a 10-year ban on holding office in a publicly traded company. I have read the complaint. She did not admit or deny, but the facts stated in that complaint were one of the great frauds of all time. really executed on the very highest level, involving the highest, most sophisticated investors in the United States, not necessarily VC investors, nevertheless, a wide variety of investors up to and including people like Rupert Murdoch. Theranos was the company that was going to revolutionize blood testing by literally taking a pinprick of blood and being able to run some 300 diagnostic tests. It turned out that that was just wishful thinking on the part of Elizabeth Holmes, but the part that got her in trouble was when she said, not only can we do it, but we will do it, and we have done it, and then proceeded to bait and switch multiple persons and parties around demonstrations. Yesterday, I think I was privileged to be a part of a group put together by Jason Meyer called Ethics Madness 2, where we live blogged about compliance and ethics during the first Friday of March Madness. And Matt Kelly had a good point that he and I certainly agreed on, and he saw it as a failure of corporate governance as well, because the board of directors really was completely absent in this case. There was some debate amongst us of whether she should have gone to jail for this. And I think that certainly a criminal complaint could have been issued, but by her agreeing to, with really no noise, literally since last summer, from her about her innocence and how that Theranos was going to fight this, really demonstrated that she understood she was in deep, deep trouble. And this is really as catastrophic or as all-encompassing a civil penalty as I believe I've really ever seen. So really a sad end to someone who had a vision, tried to execute on that vision, but at the end of the day, defrauded investors when she took their money to make this vision happen. So I don't know how this resonates out from in your part of the world. And I'm going to assign you the Silicon Valley opinion and commentariat simply because you're in California, although I recognize there's not only a physical distance, but a psychological distance between Los Angeles and Silicon Valley. So did you have any other thoughts?
I just would like to share the quote from Gina Choi, director of the SEC's regional office in San Francisco. And this quote is, "The Theranos story is an important lesson for Silicon Valley. Innovators who seek to revolutionize and disrupt an industry must tell investors the truth about what their technology can do today, not just what they hope it might do in someday." And kind of that immediately brings up Tesla in my mind, that no one can deny that Elon Musk is definitely a true disruptor, but the number of production vehicles that are coming out from Tesla are just pale when compared to the numbers that he's been guaranteeing shareholders. So I agree with you that this is definitely a very important ruling. And I would say, a lot of our stories come back to truth, right? What is the truth? What are you guaranteeing your shareholders, or what are you guaranteeing to the public? And if there's a disconnect there, it's a huge problem for both you, your company, and your reputation. Tom, your colleague Jacqueline Jager at Compliance Week took a shot at distilling compliance lessons from Novartis. What did she have to say?
So really the headline, Jay, I thought it was going to be a sort of a lessons learned or how to, but it's much more than that. And Jacqueline's a great writer, and I commend this article to everyone. And Novartis may be in some serious trouble, not only for having allegedly engaged in bribery and corruption, but really their entire attitude towards it. And the first half of Jacqueline's article really quotes from and cites to a recent board meeting, shareholders annual meeting, where the CEO of the company said, we're not sure that there was bribery and corruption. And even though we're under investigation in Greece for paying kickbacks to more than 4,000 doctors and government officials in exchange for promotion of Novartis drugs, that we're really not sure anything bad has happened, and we're just going to have to see. Of course, we don't, he went on to say, we don't really approve of bribery and corruption, but we're going to let this investigation play out before we really make any admissions or do anything drastic. And that sort of attitude, considering that Novartis had previously paid a $390 million fine, I think in 2015, really speaks of an attitude which does not seem to put doing business ethically and in compliance at the forefront. So I know this may tie into some of the points, some points you have a little bit later in another story on GIR, on recidivism, and how that might relate to monitorships. But I will have to say I was somewhat disjointed by the attitude of Novartis management that they don't seem to think they have a problem yet. They're going to look at it, but they don't think they have a problem yet. But she did add
Maybe they're using the Wells Fargo playbook, and it always works well when you testify in front of the government and speak to that.
Well, that's true, and indeed, Wells Fargo is a gift that keeps on giving. On the front page of today's Wall Street Journal is yet another investigation that has opened up around Wells Fargo. But Jacqueline did go through and lay out some of the actions which have been taken by Novartis, which included the separation of the company's compliance program from its legal function. There's a new policy for interacting with healthcare professionals and payment for sponsorship of physicians to conferences. There's new professional practices policies. There is an enhanced anti-bribery compliance program specifically around third parties and their due diligence process. And the company is disciplining people that they feel may have violated some of these. So, tactically, they seem to be moving towards the right direction. But strategically, these comments by literally the CEO and chairman of the board really portend, I think, an attitude where compliance is not in the top 5 or maybe even the top 10 of the directions a company wants to go.
Last thing I'll say is I just really love the dramatic open, the way that Jacqueline wrote it, and it was very cinematic. So I really see this guy, in a hotel, in the Hilton Hotel in Greece, getting ready to step out on the balcony and being talked back from the edge and saying, they will not put onto me all the sins of my company. So good stuff. Next up, we're going to take a look at the first French DPAs for corruption offenses. And on March 5th of this year, French prosecutors published 2 judicial conventions of public interest. And the acronym for that in French is CJIP, or French DPAs. And they've been approved by the president of the High Court of Nanterre on February 23rd. And the CJPs are entered into between prosecutors and 2 subcontractors to the state-owned utility EDF. And the companies are, probably butcher their names, SAS Kiefer Warner, which they're abbreviating as KW, and SAS Set Environment, SET. And they allege that these companies had ceded to solicitations to pay bribes to EDF, to a procurement manager, and that the behavior amounted to corruption by them on individual charged with public service. These are the first to be concluded in respect to corruption offenses, and helpfully to the practitioner, they provide detail on the financial incentive of entering into a French DPA, and also clarify that the cooperation and remediation can be significant. So this is, again, similar to the trend that we're seeing sweeping across globally, whether it's DPAs being picked up in the UK, in Australia, in Asia Pacific. We really see a trend of this happening. And when you can go through the article, you can learn a little bit about the background of the 2 companies. But, the authors, who are some attorneys from Debevoise, asked the question that despite providing welcome clarifications on the application of the CJIP regime, the KW and the SET CJIPs failed to address the issue of most concerned to companies facing corruption issues in France. What are the criteria used by authorities to decide whether to offer the company to conclude a French DPA? And from the three French DPAs that have been concluded to date, it would appear that neither self-reporting nor cooperation is a prerequisite, but they do serve as mitigating factors. So, one thing that I think for France to catch up to where we are is to start being a little bit more transparent in terms of what will get you the DPA. One other point that I thought that was interesting is, in addition to the financial penalties that were 30,000 euros in compensation to EDF, both KW and SET will be subject to supervised monitorships ranging from 18 and 24 months respectively. And here's the interesting part. The costs borne by the companies monitored are capped at 290,000 euros for KW and 200,000 euros for SET. So the express objective of the monitorship is to ensure compliance of existing anti-corruption programs with obligatory requirements for anti-corruption programs set out in Sapin II. So while they include the monitorships, the length are somewhat less than what we do here in the U.S., and to cap those at 290 and 200,000 euros seems like a very low amount. Any thoughts on that from your perspective, Tom?
Yeah, I guess on the dollar or euro amount, Jay, that doesn't really offend me because you're looking at basically for EDF or for KW rather, that's probably about $450,000 for 18 months work, and for SET that's about $300,000 for 24 months work. But it's the subsidiary, or excuse me, the subcontractor. So coming from the corporate world, once you know your cost, that's really what you want to know. And as when I do consulting or legal work, I tend to do fixed fee. So I'm a big fan of that. So no, it doesn't offend me that those amounts are set what they are. Once you know what your costs are going to be or your compensation is going to be, I think you do your work around that. So I guess the thing that really struck me was that there was still a fair amount that's unclear and unsettled under the French DPA regime. And I think you laid this out, but the Ministry of Justice circular provided to prosecutors in January of this year, or rather in March of this year, said that prosecutors should take into account the company's antecedents, which means are they a recidivist? We'll talk about that in a minute in the context of monitorships, but also whether it self-disclosed the relevant facts and whether it cooperated. It really leaves out the issue of remediation. So I think this is going to be a work in progress, but certainly it's a welcome work in progress.
Yeah, I think it totally is a step in the right direction. Why don't you tell us about Gareth Thomas' article about David Green and what UK GPAs aren't?
So, Jay, just as you are a recovering screenwriter and I'm really a movie guy, I'm really a writer and a word guy. The word on the page, not the verbal word. So I was extraordinarily pleased when David Green used the word Damascene conversation. Now I'm going to give you a pass on what that means, because what it means is comes from Saul, who became St. Paul's conversion to Christianity on the road to Damascus. And a Damascene conversion is when you have a sudden, complete change in your beliefs. And David Green actually used that word or that term in a speech. So kudos to David Green and Damascene conversions or conversions. So I'm going to incorporate that into my repertoire going forward. He gave some, I thought, really interesting remarks around that, and certainly Damascene conversions was a part of it. Under the UK Bribery Act and deferred prosecution agreements with the Serious Fraud Office, he said the one and only way to even qualify for a DPA was to self-disclose. It is, if you don't self-report, that's the essential precondition of a DPA. And Jay, why I found that either interesting or troubling was, if you'll recall, the largest serious fraud office settlement of a UK Bribery Act case ever was Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce received a deferred prosecution agreement. Rolls-Royce did not self-disclose. So I understand why he would want to say that Damascene conversions are not acceptable and that self-reporting is and will remain an essential precondition of a DPA. But if you're going to say that, you really have to put it into practice. So I thought that was interesting. But great term, great use of a term. Everybody should use that. I hope you don't, or you do have Damascene conversions, whichever way you want to go with it. The other thing was that he really emphasized that DPAs are not, in his mind, cozy relationships, that DPAs are taken very seriously, and that even with a DPA, senior executives will still be at risk under criminal prosecution under the UK Bribery Act. So I really took this as at least the report of it as a pretty strident statement by the SFO director. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I got to spend some time with David a couple of weeks ago in San Diego at the ABA White Collar Crime, and he's a very interesting chap, and he really does I think come out on the law and order side. And another thing that's a key differentiator between our DPAs and those promulgated in England are that they must be argued before and approved by a judge. So not only is it a matter of crafting that statement and negotiating, but a judge can come in and say, that this is too light a slap on the wrist, or that this is, too heavy an enforcement. So David really believes in the mission of what the SFO is doing. I think this is, clearly the mindset that he's purveying, and it'll be interesting to see if this continues, because his term is almost up, and as he usually adds in every news article, and I don't know why it's not in here, but he said he's going to be putting himself on the market and seeing where he can find future employment not in the government. So I think he's a great guy. I like what he's doing there, and as I said, we'll have to see what's coming next. Last thing that you saved for me, since it falls right in my sweet spot, we have an article from Adam Dobrik over at Global Investigations Just Anti-Corruption, and U.S. officials talk about how to avoid a monitor. So the DOJ's Sally Malloy got together with the SEC's Melissa Hodgman and had a discussion with Ernst & Young's Kathleen McGovern in D.C. on March 15th at the Georgetown University Law Center's Corporate Counsel Institute. And officials from both the DOJ and SEC say that they declined to impose monitors on companies that they trust. Sally Malloy went on to say, "It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to impose a monitor where the company has affirmatively come to you and reported something." And then she continued to say that corporate settlements without a monitor, the department has still imposed a self-reporting obligation on companies to provide updates on compliance enhancements and any possible problems. So they're ultimately, at the end, they're looking for companies and whether we can trust the company to self-report. So if you are in a position where you have actually been contrite, you have cooperated and put yourself in a position that you have a trustworthy relationship with the DOJ and the SEC, they're not going to let you not have reporting obligations, but they're going to allow you to self-report. And on the face of that, it might seem that that is not such a great deal for companies that provide monitorship services like Affiliated Monitors. But one of the trends that we're seeing is this year we are having a lot of potential clients reach out to us in advance of having any type of an issue and wanting to run a proactive assessment, which is good not only if you have a chance where you're called in front of the DOJ or the SEC, but by running a proactive assessment, you have an opportunity to have an independent party come in and take a look at how well your controls and procedures are working, and whether there may be any adjustments that you can make to have a best-of-breed program. So I choose to read this article in a positive sense, talking about how how you build trust, and if you come in from a very proactive position, you can get a better outcome with the DOJ and the SEC. Your thoughts, Tom?
So a couple of thoughts, Jay. First of all, I was a little surprised by the statement of Sally Malloy that it all turns on self-disclosure. Now, I understand that is a basic requirement, the basic requirement under the pilot, or was under the pilot program and under the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy, to receive a declination to self-report. But self-reporting is only one part of the calculus that should go into a decision of monitorship. And as you point out, it's the actions of the company, not what they say, but what they do. So if you take a few steps back to consider some of the very egregious FCPA violations, which became enforcement actions before the pilot program, then that myself and perhaps others scratched their heads, and we couldn't understand either why the fine was what we thought was so low and or why there was no monitor. And I speak specifically of Hewlett-Packard and of Parker Drilling. Parker Drilling had C-suite involvement in the bribery scheme. Hewlett-Packard had a multi-country, literally culture of corruption where there were systemic internal control failures. Both companies received less than the minimum sentencing guideline suggested penalty, and neither company was required to have a monitor. I do believe I understand the reason Parker Drilling did was because they hired Dan Chapman, who was given credit by the government for putting in literally a gold standard compliance program at the company. I don't know the answer at Hewlett-Packard because they really didn't go out on the speaker circuit and talk about what they'd done. Nevertheless, where there were examples prior to the FCPA pilot program of companies that engaged in serious FCPA violations, but were able to make a comeback during the pendency of the investigation. And in the case of both Parker Drilling and Hewlett-Packard, there was not self-reporting. Now, I do agree with not only Sally Malloy's remarks, but your analysis of the trust issue. Because if you talk to anyone who's worked in the FCPA unit and then is now in private practice, they say that trust with the regulators, trust with the prosecutors, trust with the Department of Justice is really a key mechanism for you to negotiate a successful resolution. And part of that trust is, can you or will you remediate, and can you be trusted to remediate on your own going forward? In the past, I think we've seen situations where the government was not fully convinced that the company would maintain its remediation program after the DPA was signed, and so we saw monitorships. But if a company has aggressively remediated and met the other requirements of the new FCPA enforcement policy in terms of self-disclosure and extensive cooperation, that may rise to a level of trust that does not need a monitor. But even with that is the issue of recidivism. So last year we had 3 recidivists, and of those 3, one, Halliburton was not required to have a monitor. Now, their settlement was not a criminal settlement under the Department of Justice. They got a declination from the DOJ. They did sustain a civil solution or resolution, rather, with the SEC. Nevertheless, if you're going to be a recidivist, that's one of the points that was brought up in this paper, that that's going to be a very difficult conversation not to require a monitor. But actually, now that you explain that in the way that you did, I think not only is this a positive spin, Jay, but it's really a conversation that people like affiliated monitors should have with their clients and potential clients, because it is a way to show not only a proactive approach, but also to engender trust with the government, because opening up your kimono is it's a scary thing to do, but it's something that the government's going to expect. And if you've opened up that kimono to a true third party, a true disinterested outsider, such as affiliated monitors, I think it speaks to a level of commitment by your organization. So something like this, comments like these, if the Department of Justice is going to move in this direction with no monitorship, then I think it's going to become even more important and put more pressure on companies to be more proactive in their remediation and opening up those kimonos to others and showing that to the government.
Couldn't agree more. So, do you want to tell us what you're up to, or take us home with the highlights from the Trace Global Enforcement Report?
Well, let's just highlight that because it's in the show notes. So
Okay.
Trace came out with a global enforcement report, and some of the highlights include the number of U.S. enforcement actions obviously dropped last year from the 2016 record-setting pace, but that's not the be-all and end-all. European companies continue to predominate U.S. investigations, notably in the U.K., Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. In investigating prosecutions, and prosecutions, the DOJ and SEC are maintaining roughly the same number of cases in the pipeline, which I think is an important indicia of where we'll come out at the end of the day. There's an increase in focus of payments to European officials. Brazil still is the largest country with the number of enforcement actions from last year, but a decrease in China. And then finally, in good news for all of us in Houston, the financial industry has finally overtaken the extractive industry in the number of open FCPA investigations. But oil and gas continues to face the brunt of literally international enforcement. So some interesting highlights. We commend the Trace report to you. A couple of announcements I'd like to make, Jay. The first is my new book, The Complete Compliance Handbook, is still available for pre-sale. You can check it out on my website. But also our good friend and colleague, Jonathan Armstrong, will be in Houston on April 10th to put on a half-day GDPR workshop. It's sponsored by the Greater Houston Business and Ethics Roundtable. And you can register on that site, which is ghber.org, and that will be in the show notes. And then finally, Jay, I'm extraordinarily pleased to announce a new podcast, which I'm premiering on Tuesday, Innovation in Compliance. One of the things that I've been interested in over the years is how the compliance profession has evolved. You've certainly been part of that as both a product provider and now a service provider. But I've been really interested in that. Vince Walden from Ernst & Young is my first guest, and we talk about the use of the digital twin and digital information. It's going to be a great podcast series. I've got, I think, 6 in the can. So I hope you will tune in Tuesday. It goes up on multiple channels, iTunes, Libsyn, the FCPA Compliance Report, and JDSupra all Tuesday. We've got great feedback. We have 50 people who are part of an advisory team that are going to get the episode on Sunday. If you'd want to be a part of that, you can send me an email and I'll get you in on that and get early information in addition to a white paper I put out about innovation and compliance. So I'm very excited about that. Very excited to have Vince Walden as my first guest, a great friend of compliance, practitioner of compliance, and very innovative in some of the compliance solution that he's been involved with at EY.
So I don't know if you can believe everything you read on LinkedIn, but I saw that Jonathan Armstrong may be wearing a 10-gallon hat to the Gerber event. Do you have any confirmation on that?
I can neither admit nor deny that such event occurred, if in fact it did occur, nor would I be at liberty to admit or deny if such event occurred, if in fact it did occur. And further, I will not be having a Damascene conversion on such query.
All right. Well, regards to Jonathan, and I think Most of the SCCE crew are going to be getting together in Frankfurt in the coming week to start the European Compliance and Ethics Institute. So if you're in that part of the world and can make it to Frankfurt, it's always good to get the tribe back together. So on behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rose, and Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, episode number 4, the March Madness edition. Thanks a lot and have a great weekend.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast if you have listened to it on iTunes, as it would help on our rankings and help get the word out even further about the only weekly wrap-up in compliance and ethics. Don't forget my new podcast, Innovation in Compliance, which will roll out on Tuesday. If you enjoy this podcast, I'm sure you will enjoy that one. This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening to This Week in FCPA, and I hope you'll join us again next week, where we take a look at some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories. Thanks again.